Jenny, we are at 8:01 all of a sudden, so let's
Okay.
get going.
Let's get it rolling. I'll find
Absolutely.
the PowerPoint here. And for those of us who have joined us before, as you well know, it is important, essential to both of us here that we just pause for a moment and recognize the land that we're coming to you from virtually this morning. We know from our sign-up list, people are here from all the way across Canada for sure, possibly even globally. So to kick us off this morning, Uki Abowastik, Dada Nastada, Tansi, hello and welcome to everybody, wherever you are. Thank you for joining us this morning. It could well be the highlight of both of our weeks for this week for sure. Here in Canada, we acknowledge that we are meeting, learning and sharing on traditional territories, wherever you are. For Sate and those of us here in Calgary, and that's our Calgary skyline there, we are on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy. That includes our Indigenous people of the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, the Tsuut'ina, and the Stoney Nakoda Nation. We honor and acknowledge all the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people who have traveled, gathered on these lands for thousands of years.
Thank you, Jenny. So this morning, mental toughness. And I'm going to throw a curveball here, Jenny, because this just came to me as I was thinking about how we talked about kicking it off. But I would love for folks to, in the chat, just kind of throw your thoughts in there as to what mental toughness is and isn't. I think I would love to see some of those thoughts, because that's where we're going to start with our conversation. Yep. But I'd love to see what folks are thinking first before we jump into our comments.
Let's go there. I changed my screens around, so now I have to look this way to look at the chat.
Resiliency is showing up big time. Being able to filter what is and isn't important. Flexibility, vulnerability, focus. Ooh, focus is a good one.
Part of it for sure.
There we go. See how this now it's just flying past.
Grit. Yeah, you asked.
I know, but this is good. Resilience, stamina, effort.
And like Lisa said, being able to ask for help when you need it. Yep.
Being able to grow after hearing criticism. I think we're going to touch on criticism or feed forward in a couple of weeks, so that one's good. Staying on purpose when things go sideways, like that. Not taking this personally, absolutely. Cool. All right. So Jenny, why don't we start there? You know, in your mind, you earlier this week put out a fantastic visual on LinkedIn. When LinkedIn worked for us. And you know, why don't we start there? I think that is a great place to talk about what mental toughness is and is not. So
we're bound to have people on here who either choose not to use LinkedIn or don't ever see me on LinkedIn, which is fine too. You can find both of us there. But this was the doodle that accompanied a post that I put on for this conversation actually onto LinkedIn. I'm a visual person. I draw things as I'm thinking about them. And when we talk mental toughness, what a lot of people don't know is there's actually 4 different kinds of mental toughness. And in fact, all of them came up in here in the chat there. We'll look at them in a second. So stress, typically, negative reaction to pressure. That's kind of your axes there in the diagram. And for the longest time, we've heard people say you have to have a little bit of pressure to be able to perform. There's debate on that. That's not for everybody for sure. So hence the little dude in the left. A lot of us, yeah, we quite like a little bit of pressure. We could debate whether it's worth leaving things to the 11th hour, but the sort of challenge to perform is good for us. And a lot of it's to do with how we see it. So you don't see athletes, or you don't hear athletes when they're about to have the event of their life say, yeah, I'm absolutely scared, really stressed, don't want to do this. You hear them say, I'm excited. I'm excited to swim against Michael Phelps in his day. Seriously? They've just reframed how they look at it. In our working world, we spend a lot of time on that top bit where we actually get ourselves into that stress situation where it's not helpful. And we're teetering between being able to cope and not being able to cope. And then the last bit speaks for itself. In the pandemic, I think this has taken on a whole new meaning as well. So That's what the doodle was. Thank you for the comments in there. There you go. Where do you want to go from there?
Yeah, it's no, I think for me, it's interesting, this comment around the pandemic has changed it. You've talked about this before. There's two types of people out there: those who know that they're burnt out and those who are.
Yeah.
Right. I think it's something, maybe I'm paraphrasing, but something along that line. So, I think the concept for me of, where does mental toughness help you respond to stress or to those moments where you are down and just had enough and you decide that you're gonna, rip your bookshelf out and repaint your office. Where do you, I think one of the things, we all talk about it, it sounds great, this concept of, yes, you have to be mentally tough, but how do you go about starting to actually recognizing whether you are or you aren't, and how do you build it? So I guess there's a couple of questions in there for me.
As always, yeah. So, and I think Brenda's just popped something in the chat there, where awareness of when you need to stop and recharge, and you're not going to know if you don't stop, and you're not going to know if you don't pay attention to yourself, or even listen to yourself. So we all have this mental story that runs in the background, call it what you like, negative Nelly, your inner critic, whatever that piece may be. And as that stress, as that curve goes up, that story often changes. And so much of this is on how we look at a situation, and so much of how we look at a situation depends on how we are, and how we are depends on whether we're looking out for ourselves or not. And one of the things that we've seen in the pandemic is you've now got people who are working from home. I mean, just bring in the conversation, trying to balance toddlers or people who are sick or the different demands of work. Plus, we've been completely thrown out of our comfort zones in a lot of cases, or thrown into a ridiculously comfortable zone, which isn't actually all that good for us either. It's not a wonder that we're starting to feel what the posh term pandemic fatigued. We're just done. And it's working really well for some people, and it's not working all that well for others. So I think the first bit is how you look at a situation. And then, in fact, we should do this, it's fun. So what I'm going to do in the screen here is bring up a slide. I'll try this out. Hopefully, here goes technology again. We can come back to this one in a second. All right, so on this slide now, in a moment, some letters are going to come up across the screen. Some of you have hung out with me. I'm recognizing names in the chat. So if you've seen this before, pause before you put it in the chat. If you haven't seen this before, as you look at these letters, a sentence will pop out to you. Write down the first sentence that you see on the screen. Just pop it in the chat, the first sentence that you see on the screen. There you go, and it's filling up already. And you can see really quickly that generally this switches between either opportunity is nowhere or opportunity is now here. And I like to tell the story. I was doing a mental toughness delivery. We have a 2-day course here at SAIT, and a gentleman said to me, opportunity snow here. Yeah, okay, that's where we live. Fair enough. But generally we switch. We see either opportunity is nowhere and opportunity is now here. And so the important piece for us to recognize is, as adults, we have about 50 to 70,000 thoughts a day, depends on what kind of thinker you are. And on average, 70% of them are negative. And pretty much 90% of what you thought yesterday, you'll think again today. And when we start to put it into those terms, we're running uphill already. So you have to do some work here, most people.
Yeah, and the negative self-talk or the negative thinking is an interesting one, because it carries so much ridiculously outweighed importance in our minds, right? Yep. And so I guess if that is a key thing in terms of how do you manage, I don't know if you can necessarily control your thoughts per se. If you're having 50 to 70,000 thoughts a day, that is obviously not all intentional. So I'm not sure how much you're controlling that, but it's the reaction piece, right? We had a great example earlier this week where we were trying to go stream on LinkedIn Live, and it was an utter flop. And I would say 2 years ago, I probably would have had a way different reaction than I did this week, where I was like, okay, we're not, there's no training emergencies that we're trying to overcome here. We'll just take a pause, regroup, and come back. But it's so much on that reaction piece. And so how can people get better at that? And I think you've touched on a lot of things here about really being able to tune in to what you're thinking and how you're thinking. And for some folks, that's perhaps very easy to do. For others, maybe not. But yeah, I'm just curious with thoughts, strategies on how you think about your reactions and so on. Now you're thinking about thinking, so this is getting a little bit spiraled, but
okay. So the first piece again is to recognize, and for me, I think it's recognizing when you're in different states, and so you basically listen to yourself. And the piece here is so much, as you said, when we think it, what our brain does is magnify it. And so you think it, and it's clever because your brain wants to tell you it's a fact. It's not, it's just a thought. But once you attach to it, it's a little bit like Velcro, and you stick to that rhetoric. And so pay attention. And this is the beauty of it all. There's only one person who chooses what you think. So if you don't like it, you have a choice. Now, is it that easy to switch? Is it like the little engine or whatever? Yes, I can. Yes, I can. No, it's not that easy. And you can, though, in terms of flipping that narrative. And so it's okay, perfectly okay, to challenge what you're thinking. And so we carry so much from our personal history. We all have a story. And that shows up in our adult world. So I go to say something, and that little voice in the back of my head says, well, who are you to say that? You're not an expert. There's loads of people who've got doctorates in psychology. They should be doing the talking. But I can challenge that and say, well, actually, for the audiences that I work with, maybe what I have to say is relevant. Maybe what I say will help somebody take a step, make a change tomorrow, and challenge that thinking. You don't have to carry every story that's come with you. And we're not set up for success. A little bit more now, we're getting better at it. But, the time's dating us, but when you and I were at school, you didn't challenge anything along those lines. You kind of conformed, and you followed, and you did it the way it was done. And you were led to believe different things. And we hold on to those beliefs. They're important to us, even though they're not necessarily relevant or true anymore.
Yeah. It's a great point. There's some good comments in the chat here, Tara, it's yes, and coffee is also always helpful, Tara, but it is about practice. And Tom, so much about self-awareness and self-control. And Peter, thanks for the note over here. I've always believed that you need to consistently work proactively on your brain, body, relationships, etc. Does that make sense? I think so.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right.
And it is practice. Like Tara's comment is great. Your mind's a muscle. And so it doesn't come immediately. Somewhere there earlier, we were talking about don't take it personally. Yeah. And then there's a couple of you in here who've been in mental toughness with me. We talk about a chuck it bucket. And that chuck it bucket's brilliant, but you have to practice to be able to get stuff from here, get out of your head, and then move on. There's a big piece of getting out of your head in here.
Do you want to expand on the chuck it bucket? I've known you for a while now. I think that's the first time I've heard that one from you.
There you go. Look, there's a little bucket there on that little guy. So when we're allowed to go face to face, if you come state, you'll go home with one of those. But the chuck it bucket, long story, but it stems from the original books of filling and dipping buckets. They were bought in Good series that looked at bullying primarily. And we sort of translated that, moved it across to everybody carries a chuck it bucket around with them as well. And so when you're in that conversation, somebody gives you feedback, or actually even more crucially, somebody has gone over that little slope and they're not really in control of what they're saying. Their cortisol's gone up, they're highly stressed, and they're just throwing stuff at you. We have an absolute choice at that point. So rule number one is always own what you need to own. we have blind spots. We've got to stop and we've got to recognize that. But the stuff that you don't need to own can go in the chuck it bucket. And I tell the story of how at dinner one night, one of our daughters, our oldest, who's our son, was saying something, and she just looked at me, she goes, can that go in the chuck it bucket too? Yes. In it goes. And I'm quite sure that chuck it bucket might well have been renamed in our house as well, but it rhymes with it. But we don't have to own everything. And part of that is the practice is, what do I need to own here? Let's take Wednesday, when we were trying to go live. There are two little pieces there that we can own. One, we've got to look at the technology a little bit closer. And two, we can show up and practice again. The rest of it, as you said, move on.
That's good. I love it.
Yep.
Question here from Chris. Capacity is easy to see when you run out of classrooms or hotel rooms, for example. There are just no more rooms. However, gauging capacity in people is not easy. How do you tell when there's no more room? Oof,
that's an excellent question. And I don't think it's an easy one to answer. If you're talking as a leader, we're right back to, you've got to know your people, and you've got to be in touch with your people, especially when we're working virtually. So we've said this lots of times too, that cadence of communication is really important. And the other piece is pay attention. Pay attention. If it's yourself, pay attention to yourself. We all change behaviors as that curve goes up. And when you know yourself well, you know what's going on. And I can tell you exactly today where I sit on that curve, because I've got used to spotting that and used to knowing where that is. So, listen carefully, listen to the language, listen to the body language. Listening is never just words, and pay attention.
Yeah, and Bill's got a couple of comments here in the chat, listen, empathy. Mike, Thanks for that. Regular check-ins. Absolutely. And Jenny, I'm going to come back to, I'm actually surprised you didn't go there with a common Jennyism, and that is have a conversation. So Chris, I would come back to, simply asking. You may not always get an answer. You may get the no, I'm fine, especially if you're trying to check on the capacity of somebody that reports to you or that you work with. But I think it's always fine to say, hey, you don't necessarily seem yourself, right? Where are you at? And so don't be afraid to have those conversations, I think.
I think you're right. And there's two things that sort of jump to mind in there really quickly. And one is, and this wasn't your suggestion at all, but we need to remember it, don't ask if you don't care. So if you're going to ask that question, make sure you have the space, the time, the empathy, you're in a place yourself where you can be there, really be there. Because often the first, oh, no, I'm fine. And we know that fine, good, and great often aren't true. And so are you ready to have that conversation beyond there? And sometimes, and this depends, know your people, but do we need to change the conversation? And so this is looming. It might sound like, Craig, do we need to reprioritize for the next week or two? Or do you need something off your plate in order to meet this? And all we're doing is changing language, but we're creating space for people. You'll see, if you said to me, Jenny, can I take this off your plate? You might see this.
Yeah.
The answer is yes. And so then that opens another door in there as well.
Yeah, I love that you're essentially asking the same question, but with a little bit more intention, right?
Maybe. Yeah.
Chelsea, a couple questions coming in here right now. So what is the best way to continuously convey the message to our teams not to take it personally? Prioritize self-care, take the time you need, leave baggage at the door without sounding like we are mandating it. How can we keep this at the forefront for everyone without sounding like a broken record? And yes, there's been a lot of broken records playing in the last 20 some months.
Okay, so the first thing to recognize too, when people take it personally, most times we've different personality types, but a lot of times when people take it personally, it's because they care. So we can recognize that. Like that's fantastic. If you've got somebody on your team who genuinely cares, great. And so that can change the conversation. The other one is just check in with your language. And I'm sure this will come up when we're talking about feed forward in a few weeks' time here, is if I lean in saying you, and you, there's a silent finger that's pointing there. I'm actually pushing you. Whereas if we change our language to our technical term, we talk about I statements, but I own the conversation. I noticed this, I'm curious, or I'm wondering, I'd like to have a conversation. We pull back on that piece. There's not much that we can do. Like, some people have a really huge box of shame, and they're so used to being just shamed and judged and blamed. Those are all things that we could do with getting rid of, that they'll go there really quickly. And sometimes we have to let them work through that. But what we don't want to do, and blame, shame, and judgment will throw them there, is push them in even further or quicker. Back off a bit.
Yeah. And the sorry, I just had a thought and it completely escaped my mind. So I'm just going to go to the next question here. Peter, hasn't the current pandemic, climate mandates, and perhaps woke culture create a world where you are not supposed to speak up off narrative? Conversation has been pushed aside. That's an interesting thought. Yeah, it would seem that there are potentially more triggers out there right now when you're more landmines in conversation.
Yes. I used to drive our kids crazy when I would just say, just come from kindness. And if you care, I think it's about empathy. I think it's about creating space for that. Have we got a lot of polarizing conversations at the moment? Yes, we do. And so our skill set actually is, how do we allow those conversations to happen respectfully always? Like, don't get me wrong there, but people have opinions, they have perspectives. There's a time and a place, and we're constantly weighing that and judging like that. Sometimes it's good just to let that conversation happen. And if you're not on one of those polarizing ends, if it's not your conversation, maybe your job is to facilitate that and help people to walk through that. What we're looking at nowadays is we have more places where we're black and white rather than gray. And we have to respect that. We have completely different perspectives and opinions. And we're back to the bucket. Just because you don't see it the way that I see it doesn't mean there's anything wrong with the way I see it necessarily. I mean, different topics, different subjects. But part of my respect for you is, that's interesting. I don't see it that way. Tell me more. And there's your three biggest words to get you into a conversation. Tell me more about that. I don't get it.
Yeah, no, that's really good. And I just saw a comment here as well from Maggie, all right, essentially saying that, try to remember that things are only as heavy as long as we hold them. So
yeah,
perspective, there's your chuck it bucket again, right? So, and I know where my other thought was earlier, and it was to your point around people taking it personally, Chelsea. And I think, to your point, Jenny, that can be a good thing. I think I would rather have folks that I'm working with reporting to me, that I report to, perhaps take it personally and show the emotion around that, because if they don't, it somewhat conveys an attitude of, so what? That's when, as a leader, I start to get nervous about my team if there is no reaction, no concern.
Yep. And the other piece too is, that critic piece, that anger piece. People don't have the unpleasant emotions either unless they care about something. So have the space, find out. It's important to them.
Yeah. Another question here from Jordan. I'm curious if others feel and or see the same pattern where corporate pressure and opportunities seem to contradict the empathy we know we need and should be showing, making our ability to remain mentally tough more difficult than it should be. How do we resist this as leaders?
Yep, because we've just gone leaner and we want to go further and faster.
Yeah.
And these two things don't always go together. It's what we call endurance toughness. And we also always talk about endurance toughness as the people who had to travel lots and show off in different places. And now I think all of us are just being tested on this one. So the question asked, well, what do you do as a leader? I think the support piece is really important. And so actually one of the easiest things as a leader, what are your people working on? And what do they see as priority and performance? So a lot of this is losing mental clutter and sorting that piece out. And so as a leader, check in, especially if you're working virtually or hybrid, because when you can't see them, when you're not just walking past, touching base all the time, you have no idea where their days are heading off to, what they're working on. So if their whole day is being spent on throwing emails back and forth, it's probably not going towards the performance that you need, unless their job description is send an email every 2 minutes. So what are people working on, and is it all aligned to where we're trying to go? Remember, priority until about 10 years ago, maybe 20 now, was a single thing. You can't have 6 priorities. There's only one priority. And so just align what's important, what are we doing? And keep aligning to that. And so it's that constant cadence of what's going on. In doing that, you're upping the communication as a leader. What are we working on? What's going to get in the way? And then that what's going to get in the way, there's your next actions. How do we help remove, block that, protect people? There's a ton of articles this week on meeting-free days and meeting-free afternoons. It's taking off again. It did it about 5 years ago. And all of a sudden, everyone's like, whoa, look at all the work I got done. There's a reason for that.
Yeah, exactly. And so the other thing that Jordan's question triggered for me, and you and I chatted about this earlier this week, is this whole concept of, and maybe I'm an exception in here, but do leaders place undue pressure on themselves, or is there an expectation that leaders have to be the most mentally strong person in the room? And is that always true? And how, right? I do believe there's an anonymous question here, but any suggestions for when you humble yourself and tell your leader you are burnt out? The reply is that we're all burnt out and you're basically told to suck it up. They somewhat tie together for me in that, as a leader, there's probably a little bit of self-talk going, I got to get this together because I'm the leader.
Yeah. Okay. 2 things. I think it was Mel Robbins who had it. There's an acronym called TOAST. And TOAST, I'm gonna have to look it up. We have it in here somewhere. Yeah. TOAST stands for tired, overwhelmed, angry, sad, and triggered. So this whole thing, does a leader have to be more mentally strong? I think a leader has to be super in touch with who they are and where they're at. We believe that leaders need to be stronger because we've seen leadership glorified for so many years. When I ask people, who are your favorite leaders, who stands to mind, we always get that long list of Hollywood names, and not their real names, their show names, their movie names, that whole, this is what leadership means to us. And for the longest time, that's what we promoted, was people who could live that all-American. Honestly, it was a facade. Like, really, is there leadership going on behind? Probably not. And that's not fair. There are a lot of really good leaders. And so do you have to be more mentally tough? No, you're a human. We're all messy. We come as this bundle of fabulousness. And what you do need to do, though, is be aware of where you're at. So if you're in that toast, and it's on a slide, everybody who's here will get the slide, so you'll find that tired, overwhelmed, angry, sad, or triggered. Then look after yourself so that you can support and be there. This is why we work together, and be there to be able to deliver. And the other piece is too, like we've seen it everywhere, be vulnerable, be authentic. Sometimes I think it's selective. There are times where, that difficult conversation, you've got to have it. Yeah, I'm going for it. Suck it up. You've got to have that difficult conversation. What can you do for yourself to be able to have that difficult conversation? Because you're actually messing it up for everybody else if you don't have it. And then if you're in that, you've got to suck it up. What can you do for yourself? Well, that toast thing's really useful as well, because anytime you go up that stress curve, your cortisol, that's your stress hormone, goes up too. And the real crappy thing about cortisol is it fogs your brain. You can't think clearly. And so bring that down, because then you can be present and then you can think. And so, you know, when the leader says, get on with it, you're the leader, and the leader says, get on with it, just stop for a couple of minutes, recenter, reground, whatever you need to do. And there's 101 things you can do to do that, and get some clarity. And then what's the next best step you can take? And those of you with young kids, I think that's Frozen's tagline.
There you go. I just had a couple of questions. I'll pop this up one last time here. And again, this will come out in the slide deck that follows for sure. A couple comments. So yes, stop, pause, breathe. Absolutely. Sometimes taking that deep breath can actually really just help you reset, right? And SC, Ted Lasso, when we're talking about, is that the new Hollywood leader? Perhaps. And Jenny, there actually might be a Ted Lasso leadership lesson morning that we could look at. Carolyn's got a great question here, and I think the answer in my mind is almost always yes. But can leaders just be straight with their staff? Right.
I think providing you're respectful is actually a disservice if you're not. But there's that respectful piece in there, and we're a rabbit hole, but there's a difference between intention and impact. So be aware of that. I know I've used it before somewhere in here, that THINK acronym. It's all about acronyms or boxes. But THINK is true, helpful, intelligent, necessary, and kind. And people always look at me exhausted and say, all of those? I'm like, no, two. Find two of them. As long as it's two, then yeah, you're being straight and you'll be okay. So it's true, helpful, intelligent, necessary, kind. Those are the 5 behind THINK.
Yeah. For me, the answer, can you be straight, is yes. And I've often told my teams that, if you have a question, I can give you 1 of 3 answers. Yes, I know, and here's the answer. 2, no, I don't. But I can try and find out. Or 3, yes, I know the answer, but I can't tell you right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right? And that's generally covers most situations. The third one's the tough one. And folks need to understand that sometimes as a leader, you know an answer, but you can't necessarily share at that moment in time. And folks have to be prepared for that possible outcome. Just here. Just taking a look at a couple chat. There's a couple of good comments in here. This is great. So Jenny, I think something else that I wanted to touch on before we leave here today is, as a leader, how do you help your team, or how do you help individuals on your team develop their mental strength? So you talked about something earlier, we're in this weird phase of the pandemic where some are still remote, some are hybrid, some are back. We're going to go through, Premier Kenny yesterday said he can see a total relaxation of measures by the end of March. I'm not trying to start a debate in the chat here. Please, let's just leave it. But the point being is that if and when this happens, we are going to have folks who are going to go through a huge transition again. Mm-hmm. Some have already done it. Some haven't had the transition at all through this, but there is going to be a drain on mental strength when this time comes. So how do you help your team develop their own mental strength?
That was a pause there. Doesn't happen often. Where to start? So mental toughness, as we talk about it, comes from so many different, there's sort of 5 main areas that we look at. 1, what are you focusing on? We've talked about that a little bit already. So making sure that focus is in the right place. Stress management is another big piece, and a lot of this is harder as a leader because it's on the individuals. But in that supporting and in that check-in conversation, you can check in with that. And how are they doing with that stress management? What are they worried about? Worry is often a perceived threat. So have those conversations, get that into, out of their head and into conversation is a really good first step. A lot of mental toughness comes down to our self-belief, which is made up of self-esteem and self-confidence. And again, most of the work comes from the individual. However, if you're listening and if you're paying attention, you can catch when confidence is waning a little bit. You can catch when somebody's not sure. And that's the point where realistically, sincerity is really important here, but you're an aid in that. If you believe they can do it, give them that support and help them along that way. The other piece that comes in is the motivation part, and we all love talking about the positive side to motivation, but there's a huge avoidance motivation piece, and that horrible area called learned helplessness, where we've actually talked ourselves out of doing things all the time. And so maybe as a leader, where can we grow? And we always attach that where can we grow to which weakness would you like to work on? No. What's holding you back? What would you like to work on? Where would you like to build your strengths even, or change the rhetoric, and just be there and have the conversation. But the piece of mental toughness is a lot of our work. It's an individual piece. And some people have worn anxiety, high stress, where it's a little bit like a comfort blanket. It's what they're used to. And so they have to decide that they want to make the difference before they can move on.
Yeah, you touch on the potential of those individuals, and I think we've all worked with some of them that seem to like to thrive in the chaos.
Yeah.
Versus
yeah.
for the calmer moments, right? Which can come in handy when you are in stressful or rapidly changing times. It can be just as challenging when things are steady, though.
Yeah.
So a couple questions here. I know it's important to be vulnerable straight with your teams. However, is there a point at which that crosses boundaries, i.e. going too far into telling your teams you're struggling, or going too far into venting down? Great question.
Yeah. So I don't know who said it. I've seen it somewhere, this selective vulnerability. We hear vulnerable and we think, oh, my deep dark childhood secrets. No. That's yours, hang on to that. But being honest, even as you said, yes, but I can't tell you. This is really tough. And I think, I can't put the words around it, but I think it's recognizing what it is, where you're at, and here's what I'm going to do next, because that's the modeling piece. Here's where I'm going to take action. So it's not I'm stuck, it's what I'm going to do next. And oh gosh, there's another acronym. I'm really sorry, everybody. But you can be stuck in bed. Bed is the acronym for blame, excuses, and denial. Okay. So, oh, this is really awful, and I blame this, excuse this, or denial that. That's not helpful. The alternative from being stuck in bed is to grab the oars. And oars is ownership, accountability, and responsibility. And the S is for yourself. So here's the vulnerability, here's the authentic, I'm really struggling with this, or this is so frustrating. And in the next couple of days, I will take this action. And so now what we're showing people is, yep, this is tough. This is not nice. I don't like it, but I'm going to move on this. I'm not going to get stuck here. Thanks for putting that in the chat.
No problem. And Carolyn, I just want to come back because I saw your comment here about when we were talking about helping your team. Can you remind them of how they conquered something difficult before? Sometimes people don't see their own capacity. Absolutely.
That's right? Huge. And that really, that's such an important part of our role, because that cortisol goes up, everything gets foggy, you don't remember that. And somebody to be able to say, yes, this is what you did last time. And it's so similar. It's not the same, but it's really similar. You have these strengths already. And in fact, when we talk about our takeaways, strengths is a really important piece that we have in there today.
Absolutely. Good question here from Ron. Peter, I see your question about online tools we might recommend for people to learn and practice this. I think we can take that one away and certainly potentially provide some in the follow-up that we'll send out.
There's two. We'll definitely give two of them.
Cool. Ron, how can mental toughness not be taken for not caring when having to deal with negative situations in a new leadership position and have inherited results of lack of action of predecessors, revenues are down and current budget can't support all the staff. How do I keep my direct reports to buy into the fact that we have to lay off folks on their teams? Oof, Ron, I feel for you. Been there.
It's really difficult. I think there's.
No, I was going to say, for me, I'm going to come back to the point around being straight with your team.
Yeah.
Right? There are, as much as we want the human aspect of all of this to be able to, I think, support, help everybody through every situation. Sometimes that means explaining the situation as difficult it is. And then as you have to exit people, helping them make that transition as best they can, right? There are certain times where you have to make those moves just for business viability, et cetera. It sucks. It's a terrible position to be in as a leader, but that is also why you're in that position, because you've been given the trust and belief that you can handle and help lead teams accordingly through something like that. And Jenny, if you would add.
No, I agree. I think that's spot on. The reality, like when we talk emotional intelligence, we talk about reality testing. Take the drama out of it, and be clear on the reality. Listen carefully to your language, and then in those difficult conversations, empathy is going to be absolutely key. And I love that you recognize there, Craig. It's that support piece. And the other bit I come back to, we mentioned this beforehand, look after yourself. Those are really difficult conversations, and that is a really, really difficult time to work through. And when you know it's coming, this is another big piece of it. Often we know when stress is coming. Mm-hmm. What can you do to set yourself up for success in that place? How are you going to look after yourself? How are you going to unwind? And coming back to something you said beforehand about breathing, I think it was Goulston who said we have a ton of noise in our head and too much noise in the world. But in between those two, there's a space. And so when you're going through a really difficult time like that, you need to get into that space yourself a couple of times a day. It just takes a minute, 2 or 3 really deep breaths. But just changing that oxygen and just stopping for a second helps us to kind of walk through that and keep the clarity. Yeah.
Yeah. And Mike, I love your comments in the chat there. Absolutely.
Oh, Mike, that's awesome.
But it's, honest, I totally agree. Honesty is the best policy. And for me, the other piece that I would just kind of bookend this with is that folks are going to remember how you treated them going through something.
Yeah.
They may not like it in the moment. They may never like it, and that's fine. But ultimately, when folks look back and reflect on a situation like that you go through and you take them through as a leader, they're going to remember how you treated everybody during that process. So sometimes resolve comes with the passing of time on issues like this. It may never feel like it in the moment, but that's an interesting, you have to keep that in perspective. And so one last question here, I think from Wade, that we can touch on before we start wrapping up, Jenny, and it goes to, you were just touching on this, but shouldn't we as leaders know or recognize when our teams are reaching their capacity and be prepared to adjust? I think you just kind of talked on this about knowing when times of stress are coming up. I think something else that you touched on here before is that, it's perhaps more difficult in this virtual environment of knowing when and where your team is at. And other thoughts on this one?
I think you said it, and I think that we've begun to cover that piece as well. Is lots of roles and lots of jobs follow those kind of patterns, like end of the month, end of the quarter. There's a big deal coming up. That when we know that it's going to happen, what can we do? And some of it's boundaries. It's a great team conversation. Like when we're under stress and under pressure, we overextend on our regularly brilliant qualities. And so if you're a details person, that's really helpful every normal day. If you're highly stressed and you overextend on that ability to catch the details, you'll know now so far in the weeds, you're not going to get anything done. If I'm empathetic by nature and there and supporting, but I'm stressed, now all of a sudden I'm caring for everybody and not for myself. And so what are we going to do? How do we react when this happens? And we've had so many situations in the past 2 years. Anybody can do this now. Okay, this is what happens when it's rubbish. And this is how we're going to deal with it this time. And then we can use that and say, hey, you know, I think this is a point where we might all want to take just 2 minutes. Let's just stop and re-engage or put in that transition. And these are pieces where, you know, even when times are really, really tough and, you know, you feel like you're just marching down this road and nobody's with you, when you bring your team in on that kind of thing, it comes back to what you're saying, Craig, that's caring for them. And when you stop and take notice and stop and ask the questions, that's care as well. And we have room for more compassion in our workplace. And I'm not talking about this soft, like, ishy, squishy compassion. I'm talking about that kind of tough compassion, but we can do it. We can do more of it too.
Yeah, 100%. We are at time. And so while you are drying up the next pieces to close out, I'm just going to throw in the chat, folks, some upcoming webinar links that you can certainly feel free to register. Peter, I see the question that you just popped in there. We will get to that in the follow-up material. And it's been a great conversation.
Yeah.
Really great way to close out the week, Jenny. So anyway, over to you to kind of take us home.
Thank you. So as always, one big idea, 2 things you can do straight away, and 3 questions to think of. So the big idea here is choice. I said this earlier. This is the cool piece. You choose, only you choose what you think. Only you choose what you focus on. And only you choose the attitude or how you show up in a situation. Nobody else controls that. So it's simple. Just make the choice. That piece works really well. 2 things that you can do a little bit more helpful. The first one's busy. Oops, let's go back one. There we go. There we are. So, technology gremlins are in here. One more time. There it is. All right. We're going to pause. One more acronym. It's been a day of acronyms. I use this a lot. It's adapted from somebody else. We've kind of built on it. And I think it works for you and it works for your team. Any situation, difficult conversation, just a meeting, new project, whatever it might be. 4 things to contemplate. This can take 2 minutes and you can take a lot longer. You can take an hour and build a really good session around this. But what's your role in the situation that you're going into? Make sure that you're clear on what part you're playing. What's your intention? Where are we going to go? And there was a note in the chat, it was brilliant, harmful or helpful. That's as simple as it can be far more complicated. What strengths are you bringing? We all have lots of them and they're really, really useful and they don't take a lot of effort. So note the strengths that will help you in this situation and then touch base with your energy again. You're in charge of that. You're in control of that. There's a few medical issues that mean you're not, but most of us have 100% control on the energy that we bring to a situation. So that's a really key one. And if you get the opportunity to come and hang out with me, we'll dig into that one a lot deeper in our Zoom rooms or classrooms. And then the second one you can take with you is choose to change your narrative. So whether that's your inner critic and that story there, whether it's just the story that you're creating about a situation, or whether it's as simple as, you know, just taking that time to stop and regrain and recollect. Maybe it's a difference between beds and oars. Listen to what you're saying to yourself and challenge it every now and then. You can change it if you choose to. And then our questions that will help you on the way. Are you creating a story today? And is it a helpful story? The respond piece in there, we've lived that. If you haven't read Craig's LinkedIn post, go check it out. It's a classic. This is a far better way to respond than react to a situation. And the last one, I love this. What will make today a good day? And actually, at the end of the day, you get to choose. So Friday could be really cool. Could be a great Friday. I hope yours is for sure. But that one's on us. There you go.
Excellent. Thank you, Jenny. And I just had a couple of quick questions pop in the chat about the upcoming webinars. The one on the 2nd and the 8th are a little bit out of the norm for what this Friday morning sessions are. They do have a different start time. Our Friday sessions will continue to be 8 a.m. And if you register, you will always get a link to a recording. So with that, have a fantastic day. Have a great Friday. Have a fantastic weekend. And Jenny, thank you as always. I appreciate you.
Thank you too. Thanks, everybody. Have a wonderful Friday. Make it a good one.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.